Welcome back to Talking Point. Now, all eyes will be on that National Assembly. One of the key factors in all of this will be what happens to the economy of the country. Now, markets will keep a keen eye on who takes over when it comes to the government of national unity and what path will be laid out in terms of economic growth within South Africa. Joining us now to discuss this, I'd like to welcome Khanyisa Ngesi, who is the head of investment solutions at ABSA Private Wealth Banking. Khanyisa, as always, a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Khanyisa, I think when we look at what's going to happen with that first sitting, the market's obviously going to be keeping an eye when, the Speaker of Parliament says, whoever is going to be the president of the country. Economically, what would be, from a governance perspective, the perfect pathway for this growth that everyone is looking for to actually happen?
Look, I think how we should look at it is what would be probably economically the best government framework for the country. Where we should start is probably taking into account the unique challenges and opportunities that our country faces. I mean, we are a very diverse and resource-rich nation with a history of economic inequality and social unrest. Taking that into account, I think some of the key frontline issues for the country currently, the first one is unemployment, load shedding, and a very weak and anemic economy. In my mind, the new administration must drive investment and reform to sort of restart and kickstart growth. They have to build confidence, not only investor confidence, but more importantly, tax base and sort of the confidence of the citizens at large to be able to help South Africa's economy meet its potential.
Khanyisa, right. So National Treasury says we want Khanyisa Ngesi as the Minister of Finance, and they task you with the most immediate need right now to bring economic stability to the country. What is number one priority for Treasury to go ahead and say to investors and, of course, the confidence within the citizens that, look, here's our first priority. If we get that right, we can build from then on?
Look, addressing the current energy issues that we face, I think, is critical. Restoring fiscal discipline, boosting business confidence, I think are some of the ways that I were to try and navigate and look at the best framework within which to turn the country around from a fiscal and governance perspective. I think that would go a long way in improving the economic outlook and foster a more resilient economy, because at the end of the day, that's what we want. Yes, we want the economy to recover, but we want it to be resilient and to be able to be competitive, not only in the local context, but in the global context as well. On the energy issue, I mean, you know that we've had sort of the worst load shedding in history, which resulted in significant input costs, not only for businesses, but we saw rampant inflation that affected consumers, and you and I are consumers, so we felt that in our pockets, and who were also hamstrung by very high interest rates. And to add insult to injury, we've also had a lot of global political tensions that have caused a significant volatility in local and global markets. So I think the immediate need is to address the issues that I've highlighted, which will go a long way in sort of creating a steady path to a recovery and economic resilience.
Khanyisa, obviously the GDP contracted 0.1%, so that leaves us in a bit of a tight situation at this moment. What needs to happen in order to make sure that the GDP outlook for the rest of the year has a better look? And realistically speaking, the goal to create that growth. What is the most important aspect with regards to whoever takes over in such an important portfolio like the National Treasury to create a sort of a positive outlook in terms of growth domestic product?
So I think it's twofold. And you mentioned the word realistic goal creation to have a better GDP outlook for the rest of the year. I think what we can agree on is that, look, we're already at the tail end of the second quarter of the year. So whatever reforms are put into place now realistically will probably only be felt in the greater economy later this year, if we're very optimistic, to realistically probably only from next year onwards. But I think let's take a step back firstly and look at what has the National Treasury forecast in its budget review, which was early this year in February, for that GDP growth and what that actually entails and whether that can be achieved. And that GDP growth outlook is currently 1.3% for 2024 and 1.6% for 2025. And you've got sort of more optimistic projections for South Africa by organizations like the IMF, which are expecting sort of slightly better numbers. Nevertheless, I think if you look at South Africa in the context of the global economy, the expectations are actually much lower than the 3.2%, for example, that's expected for both 2022 and 2025. So compare the global 3.2% to our very anemic 1.3 for 2024 and 1.6 for 2025. Nonetheless, I think if you look at this growth assumption, which is anemic and poor, but better than what we've experienced in the previous year, and obviously within the ambit of COVID, this growth assumption is actually supported by the expected easing of power cuts. And I mean, we've seen that. We've had significantly better load shedding at the beginning of this year.
We have no load shedding. 2.5 weeks, 2.5 months without load shedding.
100%.
Yeah.
And also the new energy projects that are going to begin production, and also the expected lower inflation that's going to support household consumption and credit extension. So what have we observed thus far? We've observed thus far, as you've highlighted, sort of low growth in the last number. The last GDP print that we saw was actually quite a slowdown. From the 1.4 that we saw in the fourth quarter to 0.5% in the first quarter of this year. Now, if you look at where the weakness was within this GDP, it was broad-based. So it was both from a production and the demand side. So on the production side, we saw that agriculture, for example, contributed the most, and on the demand side, we saw declines in sort of household consumption and government consumption and gross investment spending, which more than outweighed the rise in net exports. Now, on this demand side, you have to also take into consideration that the underlying household consumption has sort of trended to a consumer that's constrained by a multitude of headwinds, including subdued wage growth. The labor market has been very lukewarm, as you know, and high interest rates. Now, that notwithstanding, if we look forward from where we are to what we expect, we should see an improvement in the second quarter of this year with regards to GDP. Now, what makes us say that? If you look at current economic data that is coming out, it is showing to improving growth in the second quarter. For example, if you look at things like seasonally adjusted domestic vehicle sales, and similarly the ABSA manufacturing PMI number, which has averaged slightly higher in the first 2 months of the second quarter relative to what we saw in the first quarter. So I think this speaks to the question that you asked, that look, from an economic growth point of view, it has a significant impact in private sector investment. And remember, the private sector as willingness to employ more people to support economic growth will depend on exactly that. So we need to see a pickup in economic growth, and obviously that will be expressed through the GDP numbers that I've just highlighted.
Khanyisa, all that said and done, the team that's going to lead Treasury is probably going to be the most important selection within this new cabinet. How important is that going to be, that whoever it is, or from whichever political party, one may say it could still be the current Minister of Finance, Godongwana, whoever it's going to be, how important is it that the Minister of Finance and his team are the right selection for all of this growth and economic positivity to happen?
Look, it has to be a team that is effective. I mean, Treasury plays a central role in managing the country's finances, obviously, and its leadership can significantly impact economic stability, investor confidence, and overall economic growth, as we've discussed. It's at the heart of economic governance, if I can put it that way. If we take a step back, for example, and we look at the pronouncements that were made in the previous budget speech, government debt is now going to peak at about 75% or just over 75% of GDP in 2025 and 2026, with debt servicing costs. So the cost of actually servicing that debt absorbing more than 20% of revenue. So if we put this into context, it means that government spends more on paying interest than it does on public health care and keeping citizens safe. I'm talking now as a percentage in relative terms. So what this team in Treasury has to do is it has to be effective in that it navigates the sort of fiscal and infrastructure reforms that significantly impact you and I, which is the tax base, and will be the backbone of the economic recovery that is currently being projected by Treasury. So they have these projections of economic growth that they've communicated. They now need to put a team in place that will have the resources to be able to implement and effectively navigate these fiscal and sort of structural and infrastructure reforms that they have put in place.
Interesting to see how it's going to be. Of course, tomorrow, the President of the Republic of South Africa will be voted in that first sitting of Parliament. Khanyisa, always a pleasure having you here on Hilaal TV. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Khanyisa Ngesi, who, of course, is the head of investment solutions at ABSA Private Wealth Banking. Well, that's all we have for you here from Talking Point. Tomorrow, of course, that first sitting, and we will be bringing you coverage of that. And of course, I'll be with you in the afternoon looking ahead. We hope to, of course, speak to our reporter on the ground, my fellow presenter, Lukman Shadrack, who will, of course, be breaking things down for us in that first sitting of Parliament, looking ahead to that 7th administration. From myself, Raz Patel, the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.